The grand opening was everything my daughter-in-law had promised it would be. That's what my son told me, anyway. The photos looked beautiful, the ribbon cutting, the champagne flutes, the flower arrangements I had personally approved 3 weeks earlier when I wrote the check. $55,000. I remember the pen feeling heavier than usual that afternoon, but I signed anyway, because that's what you do when you love your family. You show up, you invest, you believe. The problem was, I wasn't there. Not because I had somewhere else to be, not because I was sick or traveling, or had forgotten the date. I wasn't there because nobody told me when it was happening. My name is Gerald Hutchins. I'm 63 years old, recently retired after 31 years running a mid-sized logistics company out of Mississauga, Ontario. I have one son, Brendan, 36, and a daughter-in-law named Tessa, 34, who has been part of our family for 9 years. I have 2 grandchildren, Maya, 9, and Cole, 7. I have a 4-bedroom house in Burlington that I rattling around in since my wife Carol passed away 4 years ago from a cardiac event that none of us saw coming. And until about 8 months ago, I genuinely believed that I had a good relationship with my son. I want to be clear about that before I tell you anything else. This isn't a story where I was distant or difficult or showed up late to every recital. Carol and I were present parents. We went to every hockey game, every school play, every parent-teacher meeting. When Brendan struggled through his first year at McMaster, I drove out every second weekend to take him for dinner. When he met Tessa and they got serious, I welcomed her without hesitation. When they had Maya and then Cole, I was at the hospital both times. I watched those children so they could have date nights. I helped them move twice. I fixed the deck at their house in Hamilton because Brendan said the contractor quote was too high and I still had the tools. I say all of this not to congratulate myself. I say it because what happened later makes no sense unless you understand that I was not a stranger to my son. I was his father, and I was present, and I thought that meant something. The business idea came up in the spring of the year before last. Tessa had been talking about opening her own aesthetic studio for a few years. She had the training. She had a loyal client base from working at someone else's salon, and the market in their part of Hamilton had room for another place with a certain kind of upscale feel. Brendan called me one Sunday afternoon, excited in a way I hadn't heard from him in a while. He said Tessa had found a space on Concession Street, perfect location, good foot traffic, reasonable lease. They had a business plan. They had vision. They just needed startup capital. How much are you thinking? I asked. 40 to 50, he said. Ideally 55 to give us a real cushion for equipment and the first few months. I asked the questions a reasonable person asks. What was the monthly overhead? What was the projected break-even timeline? Did they have a lawyer review the lease? Brendan had answers, maybe not polished answers, but real ones. He'd done some homework. Tessa had done more. I asked to see the business plan, and he emailed it that night. It was 12 pages, reasonably thorough, with projections that weren't unrealistic given the local market. I showed it to a friend of mine who had run a retail business for 20 years. He said it looked like an honest effort. I agreed to invest. That's the word I used, invest. Not give, not lend. Exactly. Because I knew from experience that family loans are complicated. But I told Brendan clearly, I want this documented as an investment. I want a simple agreement that says if the business turns a profit, I see a return. If it doesn't, we discuss it like adults. But I'm not writing this off as a gift. That's not good for you or for me. Brendan agreed immediately. He seemed almost relieved that I was being businesslike about it. Absolutely, Dad. We'll get something drawn up. We did get something drawn up, eventually. I'll come back to that. I wrote the check in June. $55,000. I watched my online banking for a few days afterward, the way you do when a number that large leaves your account. That slightly hollow feeling in your stomach that isn't regret exactly, but is adjacent to it. Then it passed, and I moved on, because I trusted my son. Over the following months, Tessa was busy with the build-out, and I heard about it in pieces. The flooring took longer than expected. The equipment supplier had a backlog. The name they'd settled on something with Lumiere in it. I always liked that had to be tweaked because of a trademark issue. I offered to come by and see the space twice, and both times I was told it wasn't quite ready. They wanted me to see it when it looked like something. I understood that. I'm a builder by nature. I know how you don't want people seeing your project before it's done. By October, I started asking more specifically about a timeline. Brendan said they were targeting a November opening, maybe early December at the latest. I said that sounded great, asked him to make sure I had the date as soon as it was locked in. Of course, Dad. You'll be the first to know. My daughter, I should mention I have a daughter as well. Renee, 39, who lives in Calgary with her husband and stays largely out of family business decisions, called me sometime in November and asked how the salon was going. I said I was still waiting to hear the opening date. She said, in a way that meant she wanted to say more but didn't. I didn't press her on it at the time. The first week of December, I texted Brendan asking for an update. He said they were aiming for the 14th. I said, perfect. Just send me the details when you have them. He said, will do. December 14th came and went. I didn't hear anything. I told myself, maybe it had been pushed opening date slip. I knew that from my own business experience. I texted Brendan on the 15th. Did the opening happen? Hope it went well. He replied, yeah, it was great. Tessa was so happy. Went really smoothly. I stared at that message for a long time. I typed back. Was I supposed to be there? There was a pause of about 40 minutes. Then, we kept it pretty small, Dad. Just close friends and the kids. It was kind of a soft opening. I put the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there in my quiet Burlington house and tried to figure out how I felt about what I had just read. It took me a while to land on the right word. It wasn't hurt, exactly, though hurt was part of it. It wasn't anger, though that was coming. What I felt first, most precisely, was the particular kind of confusion that comes from realizing that the world has not been operating the way you thought it was. I called Brendan the next morning. Not that evening I wanted to sleep on it, or try to, because I knew that whatever I said in that conversation needed to be said clearly. He picked up on the second ring. He sounded normal, a little cautious, maybe. I need you to explain something to me, I said. I gave you $55,000 for that business. I was involved in the planning. I reviewed the business plan. I approved the equipment list. I came to see the space when it was still empty. And somehow, when it was time to open the doors, I wasn't included. Silence. Brendan, help me understand this. It wasn't like that, Dad. It wasn't a big thing. We were stressed. We just wanted something low-key. You had a ribbon cutting, I said. I've seen the photos. More silence. Who was there? I asked. He listed names. Tessa's mother, Tessa's two closest friends and their husbands, Brendan's friend from university, who I've met maybe 4 times, a couple of Tessa's clients who she wanted to be the first through the door, 8 or 9 people in total. And it didn't occur to either of you, I said slowly, that the person who funded the entire venture might want to be present? Dad, I'm not asking you to justify it. I'm asking you to explain it. There's a difference. He didn't have an explanation. He had justifications. Tessa had been anxious about the day. They hadn't wanted it to feel like a big formal event with family pressure. They thought I'd understand, because I was pretty low-key about these things. Each one landed worse than the last, because what I heard underneath all of it was the answer they weren't saying. It simply hadn't occurred to them. I wasn't in the picture they'd imagined for that day, and so they hadn't put me in it, and they hadn't thought that would require any conversation. I told him I needed a few days. He said he was sorry. I said I'd be in touch. I spent those days doing something I probably should have done earlier. I went through my financial records, and I made a list. I'm not a dramatic person by nature. Carol used to say I process things slowly but thoroughly, like a good stock, no flash, just steady depth. That's accurate. So I didn't make the list to punish myself, or to make myself feel righteous. I made it because I wanted to see the actual shape of what had been happening over the last several years, laid out plainly, without the soft focus of family feeling over it. The $55,000 for the studio was the largest single item, but it wasn't close to the full picture. 2 years before the studio, Brendan and Tessa had wanted to put an addition on their house, a proper home office for Tessa, and an extra room for when they eventually had a third child, which they were considering at the time. The contractor quote came to $38,000. They asked if I could cover half. I covered all of it, because by that point the third child conversation had happened and Tessa was already pregnant with Cole. It felt like the wrong time to be counting. $38,000. The year before that, Brendan had changed jobs, left a stable position at a logistics firm to take a chance on a startup in the supply chain software space. The startup paid 30% less for the first year. He asked if I could help bridge the gap for a few months. I transferred him $1,200 a month for 11 months. $13,200. When Maya started junior kindergarten, Tessa decided she wanted to send her to a Montessori program rather than the public school in their neighborhood. The fees were substantial. I offered to cover them for 2 years while they got their finances stabilized. That was $8,000 per year, $16,000 over the 2 years. A family trip to Banff when Maya was 5, Cole was 3. I suggested it, and I paid for it, which was my choice. That one I'll own. $9,000. Smaller things. A new furnace when theirs failed. In January 2 years ago, I covered the installation because it was an emergency, and I had the RRSP room. $4,800. Help with Brendan's car when the transmission went, and he was between paychecks. $2,000. A birthday party for Maya's 7th birthday at one of those indoor trampoline places where I'd offered to chip in and ended up covering the whole thing because the bill came to me. $800 and change. I added it up 3 times because I didn't trust the number. $139,000 over 6 years. Not counting what Carol and I had given them as a wedding gift. Not counting the cost of babysitting that I'd never charged for. Not counting the Sunday dinners I'd hosted because I knew they were stretched, and a home-cooked meal was one fewer thing to budget. $139,000. And I wasn't invited to the opening of the business I'd funded $55,000 of it for. I want to be careful here because this is where the story gets complicated and I don't want to be unfair. I don't think my son woke up one morning and decided to take advantage of me. I've thought about this a great deal, and what I believe is something harder to be angry at and harder to fix. I had made it so easy for so long that it had stopped registering as anything significant. The money I gave wasn't experienced as gifts or investments or sacrifices. It had become, gradually and without anyone declaring it, simply how things worked. Dad handles it. Dad's fine. Dad's got the resources and he offers freely so it doesn't cost anything to accept. What's insidious about that kind of arrangement is that nobody has to be a bad person for it to be corrosive. Brendan isn't a bad person. Tessa isn't a bad person. But somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those transactions, I had become less a father and grandfather and more a resource, a line item. And resources don't need to be at the grand opening. Resources don't need invitations. I called Brendan back 5 days after our first conversation. I told him I wanted to meet in person, and I didn't want the meeting to happen at his house. We met at a Tim Hortons off the QEW, which might sound mundane but was deliberate on my part neutral ground, public, no artifacts of home to make either of us comfortable or defensive. I had printed out my list. I slid it across the table. He looked at it for a long time. I watched his face move through several things. Then he said, quietly, "I didn't realize it was this much." "I know you didn't," I said, and I meant it, and it wasn't entirely a kindness to say it. "Dad, we're grateful." "I don't need gratitude," I said. "I need you to actually see what's been happening, not the individual pieces, the whole thing." He was quiet. "I have been pouring money into your life for 6 years," I said, keeping my voice level because losing it would not have served either of us. "And I've done it willingly, and I don't regret most of it. But I need you to understand what it means that after all of that, I found out my daughter-in-law's grand opening happened through a text message the next day. That tells me something about where I sit in the picture, and that's a problem I can't ignore." "What do you want me to do?" he asked. His voice had gone small in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "I want you to understand that things are going to change," I said. "Not because I'm punishing you, because what's been happening isn't healthy for either of us. I've been treating your financial problems like my emergencies to solve, and you've been letting me. And we've both been pretending that's love. It isn't. It's a pattern. And it isn't good for you." He asked about the studio. He asked whether I still considered it an investment, or whether I was going to reframe it as something else. "That's a separate conversation," I said. "Right now I'm telling you that starting today, I'm not the backstop for your life anymore. If there's a genuine emergency, someone is sick, someone is in danger, call me. But a contractor quote, a cash flow gap, a school fee you'd rather not pay, that's yours. You're 36 years old with a working household income. You can do hard things." He nodded. He said he understood. I don't know if he did. In that moment, on the drive home, I felt something I hadn't anticipated, which was grief. Not anger. The anger had done its work and moved through me during those 5 days alone with the list. What I felt now was grief. The particular ache of realizing that a version of your relationship with someone you love has already been over for a while. You're just the last to know. Carol would have seen it earlier. She had that quality, a quiet clarity about people, even the people she loved most. I missed her then in a specific way. Not the general ache of her absence, but the sharp pinpoint of wanting her particular judgment in a particular moment. January was quiet between Brendan and me. We texted occasionally. I had Maya and Cole over for a weekend in mid-January because whatever was happening with the adults, I was not going to let it reach those children. We made chocolate chip pancakes on Saturday morning and watched a movie Saturday night, and I drove them home Sunday afternoon with a container of leftovers and 2 books I'd found at a used bookstore that I thought they'd reported. Maya hugged me at the door for longer than usual. Cole, who is less demonstrative, said bye Grandpa, and then came back 30 seconds later and hugged me too. Kids know things. The call I was half expecting came in February. It was Brendan, and he started with pleasantries that were clearly not the point. After about 2 minutes of that, I said, "What's going on?" He said the studio was having a harder first quarter than they'd projected. The foot traffic was slower than Tessa had hoped. 2 of her clients from the old salon had committed to following her but hadn't actually booked appointments. The equipment lease was higher than anticipated because of an error in their initial calculations. One of the larger machines had been misquoted at the time they'd done the business plan. "How much?" I said. 15 to 20 would get us through to spring, when things typically pick up for aesthetics. "No," I said. Silence. "Brendan," I said. "No." "Dad, I'm going to tell you what I think you should do," I said. "Call BDC, the Business Development Bank. They have programs specifically for small businesses that are in early-stage cash flow trouble. They've seen this situation 1,000 times, and they're not your father, which means they'll help you in ways that won't cost either of you anything emotionally. Also call your accountant, if you have one, because a misquoted equipment lease might have some remedies. And sit down with Tessa and look at whether there are any operating costs you can reduce in the short term without compromising the quality of the service." "You've clearly thought about this," he said, and there was an edge in his voice that I recognized and didn't take personally. "I have," I said. "I thought about it because I knew this call was coming, and I wanted to have something useful to give you. I can still be useful to you, Brendan. I just can't be useful by writing checks anymore. That's over." There was a long pause. Then, "This feels like you're punishing us for the opening." "I understand why it feels that way," I said. "But I want you to think very carefully about whether you actually believe that. I told you in December that things were going to change. I told you exactly what I meant. This isn't a surprise, and it isn't revenge. It's me doing something I should have done years ago." He said he needed to talk to Tessa. I said, "Of course." We ended the call with a kind of bruised courtesy that I hoped was the beginning of something more honest, rather than the end of something. Tessa called me the following week. I'll give her credit, she called herself, rather than going through Brendan, which I think took something from her. She said she owed me an apology about the opening. She said she'd been so caught up in the anxiety of the day that she had convinced herself it was better to keep it small and low pressure, and she had not stopped to think about what it meant to exclude the person who had made the whole thing possible. She said it was thoughtless, and she was sorry. I thanked her for calling. I told her the apology mattered to me, and that I accepted it. "I want the studio to succeed," I said. "I mean that. And the best thing I can do for you and Brendan right now is not give you money. I know that's hard to hear, but I've watched what easy money does over a long time, and it doesn't do what you think it does. It keeps you from building the muscles you need." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "Brendan's always said you were tough but fair. I think I'm starting to understand what he means." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just said thank you, and we ended the call on decent terms. It is now 8 months since the grand opening I wasn't invited to. The studio is still open. From what Brendan has told me, they did reach out to BDC and got into a small business advisory program that helped them restructure some of their early-stage costs. Tessa picked up 3 new regular clients in the spring. They're not flush, but they're not panicking, which is a better place to be at 9 months in than many small businesses reach. Brendan and I have dinner once a month now. Real dinners, not the kind organized around a request. We talk about things we haven't talked about in years, his work, his ambitions, what he actually wants his life to look like in a decade. Some of those conversations are uncomfortable in the way that honest conversations between men who love each other but haven't been seeing each other clearly often are. I think we're both learning something. I am not going to pretend this has been easy or that everything is repaired. There are things that changed between us that won't go back to what they were. I think that's probably appropriate. The version of our relationship that existed before was built on a false foundation, my inexhaustible generosity, their quiet expectation of it, and false foundations don't deserve to be rebuilt as they were. They deserve to be replaced with something that can actually hold weight. What I know now that I wish I'd known earlier: money given without conditions can be an expression of love, but when it becomes the primary language of love, it stops being love and starts being something more like control without the name. I controlled my son's sense of security for 6 years. He never had to sit with financial discomfort long enough to figure out how to solve it himself, because I was always there before the discomfort became a lesson. I thought I was protecting him. I was actually preventing him from becoming the person he needed to be. The agreement for the studio investment, the one Brendan said we'd get drawn up, never became what I'd originally intended. I consulted a lawyer about it after everything came to light, and the lawyer confirmed what I'd feared. What I had signed, months after the initial conversation, in the blur of a family dinner where papers had appeared with a casual "just for our records," was structured as a gift, not an investment. My own fault, partly. I should have read it more carefully. I should have had my own counsel review it before I signed, but I was in the warm fog of family trust, and I initialed where Brendan pointed, and that was that. I have not pursued legal remedies. The lawyer told me I had limited options, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever I might recover through a legal process would cost me more in the relationship than it was worth. $55,000 is significant money. It's not money I can't absorb. Carol and I built carefully for 40 years, and I am, as Brendan's friend once described me at a family gathering, unfairly solvent. What I'm choosing to take from that investment instead of a financial return is something harder to quantify: a clearer understanding of my son, a more honest relationship with him, and the knowledge that I will never put myself in that position again. There's a woman named Margaret I've been having coffee with on Thursday mornings at a cafe in downtown Burlington. We met at a grief support group for spouses 2 years ago and became friends slowly in the way that people in their 60s who have both learned caution tend to do. She listened to this whole story over about 4 Thursday mornings, asking the right questions without offering easy reassurance. At the end of the last one, she said, "You know what you actually did? You stopped letting your love be mistaken for money. That's not a small thing." I thought about that for a long time. I think she's right, and I think Carol would have said the same thing, probably with fewer words, probably with one look across a room that would have told me everything. I'm still their grandfather. I still have Maya and Cole on alternating weekends, and I still make the pancakes, and I still find the books. That part of my life is not diminished. If anything, I feel more present in it now, because I'm not carrying the low-grade anxiety of a man watching his resources drain out through a hole he could see but couldn't name. I'm still Brendan's father. I still answer when he calls. I'm just not answering the calls that were really about money dressed up as closeness. And I'm still Gerald Hutchins of Mississauga, Ontario, 63 years old, retired, widowed, reasonably solvent, and learning later than I should have, but not too late, the difference between being needed and being valued. Those two things look identical from the inside until the day they don't. The day they stopped looking identical for me was a December evening when I stood in my kitchen reading a text message that said, "Yeah, it was great," and understood, finally, what my role in the story had actually been. That was the last day it was that role. I chose something different, and that choice is still with me, and it hasn't felt like a loss. Not once. If you take anything from this, let it be these things. Earn the slow and expensive way. Teach the people you love to solve their own problems, because the greatest inheritance you can leave your children isn't money, it's capability. Write nothing without reading it. Ask nothing without follow-through. And when someone shows you through their actions where you rank in their picture of things, believe them the first time, especially if you love them. Love that costs your dignity is not a payment you can afford to keep making.